Members of the Interim Regulatory Committee, the media, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here to number 6 Kildare Street today to launch two key reports from the Regulation Office. The first is 1 year on the regulation of approved housing bodies in Ireland, which is our 2014 annual report and sectoral analysis. And also, today we're launching the financial standard and assessment framework for approved housing bodies, the next iteration in the development of the regulatory framework. My name is Jenny Donald. I'm the chair of the Interim Regulatory Committee, which is the body established by the Minister to oversee the implementation of the voluntary regulatory framework for approved housing bodies, and also to advise the Department on the introduction of statutory regulation. And I'll say a little bit more about the role of the committee later. We were very much hoping to have the Minister here with us this afternoon, to formally launch the two reports today. Unfortunately, he has been detained at present in a cabinet meeting. These things always happen, but we're very hopeful that he may be able to get free at some stage during the event, or perhaps Minister Coffey will be able to join us. So we may change things up a little bit in the programme just to accommodate that, so bear with us if we do. It's very encouraging, I have to say, looking around the room to see such representation from approved housing bodies, financial professionals, local authorities, and also political representatives who have all taken time out of busy schedules to be here today. And indeed, I have to say I'm very pleased to be here today to chair the proceedings, particularly as there are many organisations and people in the room that I haven't met previously, and I've been doing my best to do some hellos and introductions before we started the session here formally. Anyone I haven't met, I hope to perhaps get a chance to do so after the proceedings or in the future. Since regulation was introduced for approved housing bodies, we have been working very closely with the sector to introduce the regulatory code building for the future. The progress we've made over the last year to 18 months has been informed by that engagement, and the sector overview and analysis is a testament not only to the hard work of Rosalind Carroll and her team, but to the sector's commitment to the principles of the code and a willingness to consult with us on its development. Shortly, Rosalind will share the results from these two key reports, which give a unique insight into a diverse sector. Then Greg Campbell will be discussing the importance of regulation in meeting the challenges ahead for the housing sector and delivering new supply to meet housing need. After Rosalind and Greg's presentations, there'll be some time for Q&A and hopefully some discussion, and that will give you an opportunity to raise any questions that you may have on the presentations that our speakers are giving this afternoon. Now I'm going to hand over to someone who needs very little in the way of formal introduction for most of you. Rosalind Carroll is the head of the Regulation Office, and prior to that she's worked across a number of housing roles and remits in the Housing Agency and the Department of the Environment and Dublin City Council. Rosalind.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. It's great to see such a large crowd of people here today. You're obviously all very interested in regulation. To spend your lunchtime with us. It isn't exactly what I expected, the fascinating topic of regulation, but it's great to see so many of you anyway. Today is a really important day for the Regulation Office, but I think it's a really important day for social housing per se. It's the first step in terms of, for us, it's our first annual report, and it's the next evolution of the regulation code, and the fact that we're now launching today the financial standard and assessment framework. And it's nearly 18 months since regulation for approved housing bodies in Ireland commenced. And hopefully today what I want to show is that actually regulation has now been firmly established and embedded in the sector here in Ireland. Regulation of the sector, I suppose, is important for two reasons. The first is it's about protecting existing tenants and protecting the assets that are there, and thereby tenants, as I said. But we also want to enable the sector and the not-for-profit sector to deliver more housing. And so really regulation is a critical aspect of the social housing strategy that we've all heard so much about, in delivering the 35,000 homes that are talked about within that strategy. It's a key part of the jigsaw in terms of providing confidence in lending to the sector and having confidence in that sector going forward to deliver those units. Today, briefly, what I'm going to do is just give you, for those of you who aren't aware of the regulatory structure, a brief overview of what that regulatory structure is, and then provide kind of 1 year on what do we now know about the sector and what have we delivered in terms of regulation to date. And then I'm going to briefly go through the new financial standard and assessment framework. The Regulation Office was first established in February 2014, and it's been established as an interim regulator for approved housing bodies. The office itself is part of the Housing Agency, but it reports to an interim regulatory committee, as Jenny just said, that was appointed directly by the Minister and has independent decision-making powers. So that means while we're part of the Housing Agency, we're independent in the decision-making powers that we take. The code itself is based on a voluntary regulation code. So regulation at the moment is based on a code that was launched back in July 2013, and the financial standard which we're launching here today further extends that code to now embrace financial regulation. What are we about? I suppose our mission is to protect social housing assets and ensure quality services to tenants by regulating well-governed, well-managed and financially viable organisations. Underneath that, we have some underlying principles, the first of which is proportionality. So while we regulate the sector, we regulate it on a tiered basis. So there's 3 tiers. Tier 1 being smaller AHBs with less than 50 units, Tier 2 being medium-sized AHBs between 50 and 300 units, and our larger AHBs are our Tier 3s with over 300 units. Our other principles are, and accordingly then we regulate them differently in terms of the intensity with regard to their size and their development plans. Our other key principles are transparency and accountability. And many of you will have seen the not-for-profit sector, including the housing sector, but all of the not-for-profit sector, face difficulties in the last number of years. And part of what the regulation of the not-for-profit housing sector will do will provide greater transparency and accountability for that sector, so that taxpayers and the general public can have more confidence in the sector overall, and the councillors and the elected officials that work with local authorities to deliver social housing can have more confidence in the sector as they deliver further. And the fourth principle that we have is confidence, and that's about having confidence to lend and invest in the sector to give us more social housing, so that both the public and private investors can have confidence going forward in the sector. So why is regulation important? What is its potential impact? I've already mentioned the social housing strategy earlier, but maybe to get it more into the specifics of it. Social housing strategy has 2 core pillars. One of them is supply and one of them is reform. 35,000 new homes are to be delivered over the course of the plan. And there's a huge emphasis on approved housing bodies delivering those units within that plan through private finance and off-balance sheet mechanisms. And really, regulation is about trying to ensure that there's underpinning there for that enhanced role. So every other jurisdiction that have moved to a social housing delivery mechanisms that are based on borrowing private finance has done so with regulation being inbuilt there. So it has been coupled with regulation. And regulation is really important in terms of, one, the confidence that I just talked about, but also in terms of building capacity. So this is a huge change for our sector. Not all of the sector will be borrowing money to deliver housing going forward, but an awful lot of them will. And where they are, we need to ensure that that risk is managed, and part of regulation will do that and will help build the capacity of those organisations to manage those new risks going forward. But it is also about tenants, and that's when we talk about the reform piece. So this isn't just about AHBs that are going to go out and deliver private finance. It's all about all of the organisations. And an awful lot of what we're doing is ensuring that the significant number of homes that are there, the significant amount of money and the significant effort that has been put in by AHBs themselves, but also by the state. And you'll see later on I talk about 1.7 billion for larger AHBs has been put in to date in terms of assets for this sector. So it's about protecting that asset and making sure that those assets are there into the future for people and for the tenants that are there, and also ensuring that there's new homes for tenants going into the future. Before moving on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the voluntary nature of regulation. It's called a voluntary regulatory code. You heard me say that it was launched there in July 2013. The name is probably a little bit misleading. It's probably fair to say that it's voluntary to sign up, but funding is now prioritised on the basis, from the Department of Environment, on the basis of people being signed up and compliant with the code. It's also mandatory for all new newly forming approved housing bodies to sign up to the code before they will be given approved body status by the Minister. And in terms of the actual nature of the code, it's probably different than maybe other codes that people sign up to on a voluntary basis, because anybody who signs up to this will be assessed by ourselves to ensure that they are working towards and engaging with the code. So it's slightly different than maybe the governance code and other codes that are out there. This is an assessed code. So once you sign up, we expect AHBs to engage with it. So where are we at now? I'm not going to go through all of this, you'll be happy to hear, but maybe some of the key points. First of all, we're here, we're established, we have a regulatory framework up and running. We now have 194, it's actually 195 AHBs signed up to regulation, covering 80% of the overall stock of the sector. And within that then, 23,830 homes now being protected by regulation. In terms of what have we done, last year we managed to assess 142 approved housing bodies. We have, through that, created an awareness of regulation, an awareness of good governance and all that goes with it. And now today we're also launching a further evolution of the code and the financial standards. So we've achieved a significant amount in what I feel is a short period of time. To move on now to the first assessment of the sector, so the 142 bodies that I just spoke about there. Back in May of last year, we went out to the sector, everybody who had been signed up to the code at that point, and asked them to return to us an annual return form. We extended that date, probably quite extensively, all the way out actually until the end of last year from a July date. As a result of that, we had a huge response and we had most bodies come into it, but there were 16 AHBs who didn't return their form, and the result of that was that they were removed from the public listing, the implications of which that they had restrictions in terms of funding that they could access from the department and also probably from lenders if they were going down that route. However, having removed people from the list, and I suppose this is a positive of regulation, 10 of those bodies are already back on the list and able to access funding, and the importance of regulation is something that they can now see. So our overall response rate for the return last year was 96%. In terms of the actual assessment, what did we focus on? We focused on governance, financial viability, and performance management. And so within that then we were looking at what do the boards look like? How often are they meeting? Is there good structures there in terms of ensuring clear decision making? In terms of the financials, we looked at every single AHBs of those 142. We looked at all of their audited accounts. We also had a particular focus last year in terms of looking at sinking funds and whether a sinking fund had been established, because that goes back to protecting the asset and ensuring it's there for the future. And then in terms of performance, we would have looked at things like, are the properties being maintained? Are they being repaired? What type of vacancies exist? So part of what we want to do, and we've heard a lot about housing in the news recently, is ensure that the assets are being used to their optimum. So by looking at the vacancies, we're ensuring that they are. And we also looked to ensure that tenants were informed of what their rights were by ensuring that there was proper and structured policies in place with regards to repairs, with regards to arrears and so on. And overall, the results for the sector, given that it's the first year that the sector has been formally regulated, were really, really positive. And for most people, what they got was an individual assessment report with key recommendations. And those recommendations, we have given most bodies until the next assessment period to implement those recommendations. But like anything, there will always be areas for improvement. In particular, there were 17 bodies that we felt that there was issues that needed to be maybe addressed before that, and so we've asked for those bodies to engage with us before we get to the next return period. And that would have been on issues like sometimes just looking for assurance on a particular issue that has cropped up, but sometimes it's just trying to look for more clarification or more robust governance arrangements, or ensuring that we get assurance on the financial viability of an organisation. So what do we now know about the sector? Well, actually, just doing those 142 assessments can tell us a huge amount of the sector that we never knew about before. So what we now know about the sector, we know a huge amount about the stock. And I suppose just before I move on to that, what I wanted to say is when I go through these figures, they only relate to the 142 that we assessed last year. So they're not in respect of the 194, and they're not in respect of the 500 bodies that have signed up. And in addition to that, I suppose, This year, we're looking at the figures as a baseline. But what we're going to see going forward when we come to this report next year is we'll be able to track trends, track improvements, and see how the sector is performing overall and how do they compare from last year. But even without that this year, we have still learned a huge amount of the sector that we wouldn't have known before. And one of the main things that we would have learned about the sector is we all know that the AHP sector in Ireland is very large and diverse. However, when we went to do the assessment, what we actually found was that 10% of the sector hold 80% of the stock. So the larger AHBs, or Tier 3 bodies, actually hold 80% of the stock. And even though 66% of the bodies signed up are Tier 1 organisations, they only hold 6% of the stock. So that begins to tell its own story about the type of sector that we have, that the smaller organisations have smaller amounts of stock and are probably more community orientated, while the larger organisations are holding a significant amount of stock. We also looked at how long have these organisations been in existence. Again, a very interesting tale to tell here. 84% of the sector have been established for over 10 years. And if you look at Tier 3 bodies, or larger bodies, we haven't had one Tier 3 body established in the last 10 years. Again, if you think about the context of the social housing strategy and delivery, what does that tell us? It tells us probably that the sector evolves very slowly. So what do we need to do to change that to deliver 35,000 units? And what you'll see is that the only sector that is developing and creating new AHBs is the Tier 1, the smaller sector. 9% of the Tier 1 AHBs were established in the last 5 years, whereas there was no Tier 2 and no Tier 3 bodies established in the last 5 years. In terms of governance, what do we know about the sector? Governance was a key focus for us, and I think, and you'll hear Greg speak later on, probably a little bit about governance as well, but governance, if you look at regulatory failures without the housing sector in other jurisdictions, you'll find that most of the regulatory failures result from governance. So even if it's a finance issue, you will always track back that decision to governance. And that might be because the board wasn't challenging enough about a decision that the executive was bringing them, or it might be because the membership of the board didn't have the appropriate skills to understand the decisions that they were making. So governance really has to be a key focus for us going forward. And what we found, we looked at a lot of things. I'm only talking about 2 specifically here today. We looked firstly at what are the formal governing board policies that are in place amongst the sector. And within that, positively, we found that most, 75% organisations have an official policy with regards to board membership. 73% have an official policy with regard to board renewal. But for us, in terms of improvements going forward, the areas that we want to see going forward would be around conflict of interest policy. So this is an area that the sector will need to improve on going forward for next year, that there's official policies that can deal with the fact that what happens in my capacity as a board member, I'm in conflict, I have a different interest that now competes with an interest that I'm making in the interest of this organisation that I'm working for. The other area that we looked at was how long have the board members been in place? Again, really positively, 39% of the sector's board members had been in place for under 5 years. On the other end of the spectrum, however, 20% of the board members have been there for 16 years or more. And again, what that points to is we need to work with the sector to ensure that there is board succession planning, to ensure that there's a good balance between new and old members on the board so that the boards can challenge decision making and that there's fresh thinking within boards and that there's not in danger of becoming groupthink, so that decisions are treated robustly and challenged. The other thing we looked at in governance is what type of organisations are they? And again, interestingly, we found that over 40% of the sector's organisations are entirely voluntary run with no employees, which is a huge thing to say. But actually, when you look at that a little bit closer, 93% of those organisations within the 41% are Tier 1 smaller organisation. And again, it begins to tell the story of maybe smaller organisations that serve a specific purpose, have been set up to serve a local community. And then we have larger organisations who have broader purposes and are maybe trying to treat and provide housing for a broader population. So what do we know about the sector in terms of performance management? Again, we looked at a number of areas in performance management. I'm not going into all of them here. But I would say that performance management is the area that the sector did best on in terms of the 3 areas that we looked at. The sector performed really well in these areas. And overall, one of the areas that we focused on was vacancies. As I said, that's really important, particularly when there's such pressure on our housing stock in the country at the minute. And on average, the sector had vacancy rates of 10.7 weeks, or an average void of 2.5%. And while that's really good performance, we will still be pushing for that performance to get better over time. In terms of having formal policies in place, the AHB sector did really well in terms of having complaints policies in place, issuing rent receipts to tenants, but the areas to work on is ensuring that there's formal rent arrears policies, that there's formal repairs policies, and there's formal allocation policies. And again, most of those are probably there on an informal basis within the AHB sector. It's about putting them onto a formal footing so that if a tenant wants to, they know what are my rights with regards to repairs, who is getting these properties, and what can I expect if I fall behind on my rent. In terms of the finances, what do we know about the sector? As I said earlier, we looked at the accounts of all AHBs to just look at viability, but we also then had a specific focus on sinking funds. And again, on a positive note, 72% of the sector have sinking funds in place, but that's 28% of the sector who don't. And in terms of protecting our assets and ensuring that they're there for the future, we need to ensure that that is dealt with over the next number of years. We also need to not just look at whether a sinking fund is in place, but whether the sinking fund is adequate. Is the money being put into the sinking fund going to provide for that house in the next 20, 30 years? So one of the things that we'll talk about later when we look at the financial viability standard is how we do that going forward. For Tier 3 bodies who maybe have more complex finances, they have more larger scale finances for a start, but also some of them may have begun to borrow monies from the private sector, from commercial lenders and so on. They're required to have strategic plans in place, financial plans and risk registers. And again, the sector is performing well in terms of 93% and 86% respectively have strategic plans and financial plans in place. But we do need more robust risk management, particularly if we're changing how we deliver social housing. And that, again, will be a core focus for us moving forward. The sectoral analysis also allowed us for the first time to get aggregate data on the financial performance of the sector overall. And we looked this year just at the larger organisations, so the Tier 3 organisations. And we're now able to say for those larger organisations, their total asset value is 1.9 billion. 1.7 billion of that has been invested by the state directly through capital grants. And I suppose if we were to look at this in a few years' time, if we were to see success out of regulation here today and out of the sector's ongoing development, we need to see that figure coming down and more private investment going up. So that's how we need to measure some of our success going forward. Overall, we think the sector, particularly the larger ones, are operating on a financially sound basis. 62 million was the annual turnover for the larger AHBs last year with an operating margin of 17%. And we do think there's huge capacity for borrowing for the sector with a gearing ratio or a loan-to-value ratio of only 2.6%. So what have we learnt? What are our emerging issues and priorities in terms of what does regulation need to focus on and what does the sector need to focus on over the next year or two? I've already mentioned improvement of sinking funds, but not just the sinking fund, but the methodologies by which we're putting the money away to ensure that it's adequate. We need to ensure more robust risk management, particularly for larger AHBs who are taking on more risks. Good governance is something that all of the sector needs to look at. For smaller AHBs, it might be about board renewal and making sure that you have the appropriate number of board members, making sure that the board policies are in place. For larger organisations, it's making sure that there's an understanding of what the executive does versus what the board is doing, but also in terms of larger organisations and group structures, we particularly need to have more clarity on how those group structures are operating. We need to get better at recording performance management, but also monitoring it to allow for more effective performance going forward. For all organisations, we need to have a greater focus on financial viability. One of the things that we looked at for smaller organisations, particularly, that are reliant on support money coming in from the HSE and other bodies, was that delays in money coming in and cuts to funding was actually having an impact on the housing assets that are there, because the boards were having to supplement housing monies to provide for support services. And that's something we're going to need to watch going forward if we're to ensure that assets are there going forward. To move on to the financial standard and assessment framework, this is now, as of from today, part of the regulation code. And what it does is it sets out the financial viability standard for the sector and our approach to how we're going to monitor and assess the financial health of AHBs going forward. The work of the financial standard is a culmination not just of the Regulation Office or the work of the Regulation Office, it's actually of the sector and an awful lot of individuals. Firstly, we got Campbell Tickell, and Greg will talk to you later, to advise us as our professional advisors on the development of this financial standard. But we also worked with a financial capacity group that was set up by the Department of Environment specifically for that purpose, and we have worked with working groups for each tier level to ensure that proportionality principle that I talked about earlier exists and continues within this framework also. And what is our purpose? Our purpose, again, is about protecting assets and building confidence. It's the same message that we're getting over and over. It's just that we're making the framework more robust as we go along. And what we do in terms of evolving that framework, what we're looking for is that by the time we get to statutory-based regulation, that in actual fact it's a very smooth transition for AHBs. There's not a big step up. Regulation is starting now, and we have a slow curve where we can develop that regulatory framework over the next couple of years. And as I said, it's underpinned by the principles of transparency, accountability and proportionality. And in particular, in terms of proportionality, it means that there's different aspects of the financial standard which apply to different sized organisations. Its objectives, well, what we wanted to do is be able to tell us about the early warning signs of any kind of emerging risks within the sector or within an individual AHB. In terms of financial and governance disciplines, we want to ensure that they're instilled to support AHBs of all sizes, one, manage their existing services, and for those who want to develop and use private finance, that they develop the disciplines that they need to be able to do that so that they can manage risks going forward. We'll also be monitoring key financial ratios. So has an organisation got enough cash? Is there enough liquidity? Are organisations planning for the future where they need to be planning for the future? And then it also allows aggregated data. So we've had a glimpse of that today, but going forward we'll have much more robust data on the sector so that all the stakeholders that are investing in the sector and the public and the tenants know about the sector that they're investing in and can say, yes, that is financially sound and this is where they're putting their money. The pilot of the standard will commence this year with 9 Tier 3 AHBs, and I'll come back to that later. In terms of the key requirements, as I said, it is proportionate, but an annual financial return will be required by all large AHBs and by some of the Tier 2 AHBs. Business plans with 30-year projections will also be required by some AHBs. Now, when I first talked about that, there was a lot of people that laughed at me and said they'd have to have a crystal ball to do things about to know what they want, how to plan for 30 years' time. But actually, what we need to understand is housing isn't like other areas. Housing has to last. You have to protect the assets into the future. So the decision that you make today, actually, we need to ensure that those assets are there going forward. So in reality, what we're asking people to do is think about that plan over that 30-year period to ensure that those assets are there going forward. In terms of their development plans, we're only asking for a 5-year pipeline to be put into the business plan. Sinking funds related to stock condition surveys are something that we're requiring all of the sector to do. So over a period of time, we will require all approved housing bodies to have stock condition surveys. And that goes back to ensuring that there's an adequacy there in terms of the actual sinking funds that are being put aside to ensure that they are sufficient going forward and they're related to the condition of a stock rather than I'm going to put away X amount of my rent, but how do you know that X amount of your rent is going to suffice for the future? All AHBs are also going to be required to notify us of certain events, and that could be events such as a CEO leaving, a chair resigning, a finance director resigning. They're also going to be required, if they're larger organisations and involved in finance, to notify us if their liquidity falls below a certain ratio. All AHBs will be required to tell us if they are being sued for a significant amount of money and there's a threat to their organisation, or if there's a significant health and safety breach. And the purpose of these notifiable events isn't that we're going to start a big investigation, it's to provide assurance to us that the matter is in hand. So what will we do with all this information? Well, our role will be to assess and monitor the short-term and long-term viability of organisations. And when we're looking at the short term, what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at audited accounts, the annual financial return that I just spoke about, how much cash is in the organisation, where is the money coming from? Are they reliable sources of income that you can think about going forward? So if you're relying heavily on donations, what bit of your business is that then supporting? And then we're looking at things like liquidity and also reliance on overdraft. So are you continually relying on that overdraft? And again, it's about reliability in terms of funding. In terms of long-term viability, what we're looking at is the business plans. Have you planned for the future? Are you going to be profitable into the future? What level of debt to equity do you have? So in terms of your gearing, what are your sinking fund and stock condition surveys looking like? So just to move quickly on now in terms of the implementation timeline. As I said, 2015, we're hoping to pilot, or we are piloting, the financial standard with 9 Tier 3s. That'll move forward into 2016. It will be applicable to all Tier 3s at that point, and we will initiate a pilot with Tier 2 bodies. In 2017, all Tier 2 bodies will be coming under the remit of the standard, and we'll then start a pilot with Tier 1s, so that by 2018, this standard will apply to all of the sector. And what we would hope by 2018 is that we would be in a position to provide published reports in respect of our larger AHBs, so with that theme of transparency and accountability, so that all stakeholders can see how the sector is actually performing. These are the list of the pilots that are partaking in the pilot this year. So we have Circle, Clanmill, Clúid, Focus, Hale, NABCO, Oakley, Respond and TUA. So to finish up, I suppose we are at the start of a regulatory journey, but I think we've already got to quite far to date if you look at the amount of work that has been done there, the assessment that has just been done. But legislation is a critical next step for us. We know from the sectoral analysis that one size does not fit all, and proportionality, therefore, is something that we will ensure that we continue to work with the sector as best we can. We're not setting up anybody to fail here. We are talking about enabling regulation that lets the sector achieve more. We know that regulation is essential in terms of underpinning the expanding role of the sector in delivering new supply. And so we need to think about regulation in that terms. Think about regulation as something that allows the sector to deliver more units. All of our objectives is the same. We all have been set up for the same reason, and that's to provide for people who don't have homes. And with that, we will work together with that joint objective to hopefully ensure that existing tenants are protected, but that more units are delivered. The sector is in a really good position. They've achieved a lot over the last 30 years, and what we want to do is to help them achieve more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Some very positive numbers there in that presentation and a lot of detail, so I'm sure there will be questions. But what we'll do is we'll move on to our next presentation and then allow some time for that at the end. Our next speaker today is Greg Campbell. In my day job, I work for the Northern Ireland Federation of Housing Associations, and we've done quite a lot of work with Greg on good governance. So I'm delighted that he's here today to be able to share some of his experience on governance and regulation with us. Greg is a director of the management consultancy Campbell to Kell. He has experience and expertise in social housing, local government, the voluntary sector, and also the private sector. He's worked directly with more than 300 organisations, tackling a wide range of strategic and operational matters, and has extensive national networks across housing, social care, local and central government. And today he's going to be addressing why regulation of the approved housing body sector matters. You're very welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Jenny, and yes, good afternoon, everybody. I think this is an important and exciting stage in the process of seeing the AHB sector grow and develop into a major player in housing provision across Ireland, and to become increasingly a central partner in that respect of local authorities, central government, and local communities. And we've been pleased and proud to work with Rosalind and her colleagues in the agency's regulation office, as well as to consult and liaise with sector representatives in helping develop this key element of the regulatory framework. Now, one thing I wanted to do before I move on is just to pick up on a point that Rosalind was making about the causes for housing bodies, housing associations, in our experience going wrong. And I just wanted to highlight this. There's the pointer. This publication, which was issued last month by the English social housing regulator, the Homes and Communities Agency, and is the fourth in a series called Learning from Problem Cases, with analysis of what has gone wrong with particular housing associations in England that have got into major regulatory difficulty over the years, and in most cases, I'm afraid to say, no longer exist. They've had to be transferred, in particular cases, into other organisations, or their assets have had to be transferred, and so on. And this publication was one that we produced. A number of my colleagues worked on that, as indeed we did with the previous such publication, which was issued a number of years ago. And what Rosalind was saying is absolutely right. In our experience, in other jurisdictions of housing associations getting into difficulties, regardless of the presenting issue, whether it's performance-related or financial matters, and finance is more commonly an issue than many might expect, ultimately the failures are all traceable back to failures in governance. So, moving on, I don't really want to speak to this particular slide. Certainly I'm not here to advertise, but my point is to note that because we've got experience of working with the social housing regulators in different countries across all of the UK jurisdictions, as well as more recently, of course, with the housing agency here. And because we've got experience of dealing with a number of organisations, a considerable number of organisations that have got into particular difficulty, we've been able to bring to bear our experience of what works, and also to an extent what doesn't work in regulation. So, thinking quite broadly then about why we have regulation. I mean, in several senses, it's quite straightforward. It's about what one wants and expects the voluntary housing sector to deliver. So, significant increases in the supply of homes to meet housing need, ensuring that those homes are secure, well built, well managed, and maintained, ensuring that housing providers operate in an open, accountable, and transparent and indeed responsible manner. And at the same time, ensuring that lenders' investments are protected, that that one is able to avoid a loss of social housing from the sector, and crucially, also, of course, avoiding tenants' homes being in one way or another put at risk. I don't see regulation as being about protecting individual housing organisations. Rather, it's that those providers, those associations, AHBs, are the agents or the vehicles for ownership and delivery of homes and services. And in that sense, they need to demonstrate that they are fit to receive investment, use it widely in delivering quality homes, and deliver high standards of housing management and maintenance. As for how this can be achieved, again, reasonably straightforwardly, dare I say, it's about, tell me or call back, it's about having in place a body of requirements to enable AHBs to demonstrate that they are fit for purpose, that they are well managed financially, that they understand and are able to manage risk, that they deliver quality in homes and services, engage with their tenants and external partners and stakeholders, operate in a transparent and accountable manner, and have a positive and open relationship with the regulator. That is what the body of requirements should provide for. I don't think it's about being prescriptive. Certainly as regulation develops and the regulator has a growing and more comprehensive understanding of the nature of the sector, but also particularly the regulated, the AHBs, understand how they can best respond to regulatory expectations. One doesn't want to see a regulator specifying in huge detail how the AHB should carry out its work. Rather, it should be up to the AHB to demonstrate how it meets the requirements of regulation, to demonstrate how they follow good practice, indeed best practice in governance, that they understand their business and the particular drivers that affect how the business performs, that they maintain their focus on their mission as voluntary housing providers, that they understand the risk areas that they face, that they deliver effective performance and indeed value for money. And crucially, if things go wrong, and they can go wrong for any organisation, as we will all recognise, that arrangements can be made to safeguard the business and most particularly the homes, the investment in it, and the position of their tenants. Thinking about some key issues in relation to the regulation of AHBs. Plainly, the AHB sector is going to have a key role in the provision of new housing across Ireland. And in helping to facilitate that, I believe it's particularly important to move from voluntary regulation to statutory regulation. It's about demonstrating essentially that the sector is fit to attract private finance and to demonstrate a commitment to the principle that AHBs should be well-run and professional bodies. And in that sense, being subject to statutory regulation should not actually be a big deal. At the same time, I would say it's right that all AHBs should be subject to regulation, regardless of their size. And this would by no means be unique. And in England, for example, where there are something like 14 or 1,500 housing associations ranging from the very smallest, which will just have a handful of properties, through to the very largest, all are registered housing providers, though there are indeed two levels of regulatory engagement, depending on size. And in that sense, I think that what is being put forward by the Regulation Office to have a tiered approach is entirely appropriate. There is no one-size-fits-all for housing regulation. And if one takes the UK, there are four different forms of housing regulation, albeit with certain similarities for each of the main jurisdictions. And while there is valuable learning to be taken from other countries, and indeed not simply the UK, plainly the blueprint needs to be one that fits the Irish dimension and the Irish sector. And the other point I'd make in this context is that the main focus that we're talking about today is financial regulation. But as Rosalind has demonstrated, governance and performance management are equally important as part of the sort of circle or wheel of regulation. What difference can we expect regulation to make? From the point of view of social landlords, or perhaps more widely, if I came across not just a housing association or an AHB, but any other regulated entity where they said to me, we welcome the extra work that's involved in dealing with regulation, it would be a bit of a surprise. Because the reality is there is extra work, and it can feel burdensome. And it can especially feel burdensome when you're being expected to do things that you haven't been expected to do in the past. And recognising that, it will require support in training and capacity building as far as AHBs are concerned. And in that sense, time to prepare, following the timetable that Rosalind has sketched out, is actually quite important, particularly for the smaller and medium-sized organisations. But the reality is that if regulation is drawn appropriately to the circumstances and the needs of the sector and government and other partners, it should actually be about what well-run businesses are going to be doing anyway. It shouldn't be a surprise. And I would say that the requirements, the documentation and so on that's sketched out in the financial standard very much fits what I would expect any business in whatever sector to have at its disposal. Regulation should also be a means of driving improvement in the delivery of new homes, maintaining existing homes, and in services to tenants. And crucially, it will also support access to substantial new sources of long-term investment. And given the changes in the funding regime here, that is absolutely crucial. That will be a central part of in terms of the engine of growth. What difference can we expect regulation to make for other key players, if you like? As far as tenants are concerned, and perhaps especially for new tenants as new homes are developed, it will give them confidence that they can rely on their landlord behaving appropriately, treating them in the right way, maintaining their properties as one would expect, and providing the services that they have signed up to. And that's perhaps particularly important for those new tenants who may not be familiar with social housing providers. It's about promoting openness and transparency in terms of information for tenants. And also, and many will recognise this in areas where there is overcrowding, for instance, it can help increase access to additional housing that will relieve that. As far as funders are concerned, regulation will demonstrate that AHBs are suitable sources or homes, perhaps, for investment, and in that sense are low risk. And many funders are looking for a low risk investment. It provides reasonable assurance to funders that they will not experience a loss on default, which for other regulators has always been a major concern. And it will promote the widening of professional business practice across the social landlord sector that enables longer-term investment planning on the part of funders. How successful has regulation been in other places? If one uses the UK as an example, there have really been quite a few housing associations that have gone very close to the wire, but none to date has ever gone bust. Regulation has plainly, in different forms, been a driver of improvements in performance, in the quality of homes, and in sound financial planning. Funders' investments have been recognised as secure and low risk, and it's generally felt that it's been worth about 0.5% reduction in interest rates charged by funders, housing associations, registered providers, being part of a regulated sector. And 0.5% is quite a lot when you think about, in England alone, registered providers borrowing facilities of over 100 billion euros being issued, and around 85 billion euros have been committed. So 0.5% is actually quite a big deal. And the other point is that in the context of a regulatory environment, bond investments in England and also in Scotland have become particularly popular over the last few years. And opportunities there have certainly attracted funders. Initially, at a time when banks were, not for reasons to do with the housing sector, less willing to lend long term, although now that market has been opening up again. There isn't any room for complacency despite that. Just having regulation in place doesn't prevent organisations getting into difficulty. And the reality is that many housing organisations are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to market conditions. They may be vulnerable to political and legislative change. They may be vulnerable to the particular area of business activity that they focus on. And sometimes they may be vulnerable at an individual level because their business model and structure are problematic. And those organisations' ability to remain in operation and to ensure that their assets, funders' investments, tenants' homes and services remain secure relies on effective, practical, appropriate regulation. If you don't have regulation, conversely, what can go wrong? I think the classic example is what happened 3 years ago, if I remember rightly, in the Netherlands. And I don't know if you can, up the top right is a report called The Balance Upset. And if you want to, for students of these matters would like a scary read, then I recommend that publication. The Netherlands housing association sector lost regulation or got rid of regulation around 1990. Effectively got rid of regulation, and it was part of quite significant changes to the structuring of the sector and its relationship with government, which I won't go into now. But the point about this publication, The Balance Upset, that was released 2 years ago. By the Dutch equivalent of the ICSH, ADIS. And it was in response to, it was a submission to parliamentary inquiry into what had gone wrong with the housing association sector. And in the 20 years or so following regulation effectively disappearing, there were 24 major scandals in Dutch housing associations. And we're talking serious scandals: corruption, mismanagement, incompetence, fiddling, culminating, or the biggest example of which was Vestia, which a number of you may know of or may have come across, which is a fairly huge organisation, 90,000 homes based in the Rotterdam area. And when they nearly went pop, it was with potential exposure of 2 billion euros. Now, a 90,000 unit organisation might seem very remote given the nature of the sector in Ireland, but perhaps a couple of English examples of organisations that didn't actually go pop, that were saved, bringing it down to a scale that doesn't seem necessarily so distant. 2 years ago, Cosmopolitan Housing Group, based in Liverpool, 15,000 homes, went very close to the edge with potential exposure of about 100 million sterling, particularly over the activities of its student housing subsidiary, which had 3,500 homes, wasn't registered, and its liabilities impacted on the group parent. And going back a few years further, Ujima Housing Association, a London-based association, which had 5,000 homes and also went extremely close to the wire with potential exposure of 200 million sterling, it was said. So organisations of different sizes can be at risk, and regulation is critical in order to avoid lenders losing funds on default, potentially social housing being lost to the sector, and ultimately tenants' homes, which could, under certain circumstances, face transfer to creditors. And what I'd like to leave you with is some thoughts on some of the challenges for AHB regulation. Effective regulation, and what Rosalind was reporting from the first year of, if you like, full-blown regulation, albeit under the voluntary code, was very impressive. But effective regulation on a continuing basis, particularly given the number of AHBs that there are across the country, relies in part on the regulator having the resources that they need to engage effectively with AHBs on the ground and to understand what are the drivers, what are the issues for each of those organisations. And resourcing for the Regulation Office is something that I hope will be looked at in the future. Training and support for AHBs to enable them to develop capacity to engage effectively with regulation, I've mentioned, and obviously the sort of 3-year timescale for implementation will help there, provided that such training and support can be identified. Avoiding dependence on the regulator. I mean, one thing that I've seen in other places is, and for one example would be the English system up to a number of years ago, where, and perhaps also the Northern Ireland system currently, where the requirements that are placed on regulated housing bodies are incredibly prescriptive in certain areas. Now, there might be an argument for doing that in early stages, but over time, one needs to move away from that. The issue should involve a recognition that the regulator isn't there to run AHBs. And AHBs, by the same token, should not expect the regulator to tell them exactly how to do everything. And the converse of that, if you like, is the bottom point. The regulator shouldn't try. It's about regulation, not prescription. Important to have effective engagement with the process with and by the Irish Council for Social Housing. As the trade body, I think the ICSH has a key role to play, and I know that the ICSH has been very much involved in the discussions around regulation, but the trade body is important in representing the views of the sector to the regulator and indeed to government. Mechanisms to hear the voices of tenants in regulation. That's not an easy one to deal with, but it's an area that I think should be looked at. What opportunities are there, appropriate opportunities for tenants to express a view about how they are regulated and where perhaps improvements could be made. One regulator. You really do just need one regulator. I'm conscious that the Charity Commission has been recently established. The worst possible situation in regulation is having more than one regulator tripping over the other. It makes life very difficult, not just for the regulators or would-be regulators, but also for the organisations that are being regulated. And the last point I want to mention here is about the importance of periodic review of regulation, which I have to say, I think the framework essentially provides for. As the sector matures and develops, and indeed grows quite significantly, taking account of the numbers that Rosalind's mentioned, it's important that regulation can evolve. And the Northern Ireland, as many of you will be aware, the Northern Ireland regulator, the Department for Social Development, has recently been conducting a consultation on a new regulatory framework there, which indeed does that, recognising the changing, maturing nature of the sector there. And that's probably enough from me. And my colleague David Williams is with us today, and David was centrally involved in our work with Rosalind and her colleagues at the agency.
very much, Greg, for what I have to say was a very honest assessment of what is required by regulation. I'm scoring out the line in my speech that says regulation should not be onerous, in line with those comments. I'm now going to open the floor to questions on the presentations and also on the publications, if you've had a chance to flick through them. We do have some roving mics in the audience, so if you just want to raise your hand, indicate that you want to ask a question, just give us a few seconds to get that to you, and if you give us your name and the organisation that you're here with today, and if you want to direct your question to a particular member of the panel, you can do that. I should add that we are joined on our panel by Sophie Garrity, who is the Financial Regulation Manager. So if anyone has a question on gearing or interest cover or anything like that, we're going to direct that Sophie's way. Okay, so we have a question just here at the front. 2 questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Jerome Casey, Circle Voluntary Housing. Could I just take up something that Rosalind said earlier about Tier 3, that it had a very slow rate of growth. We're the last Tier 3 to be formed in 2003. First scheme came in 2006, and then within 5 years of foundation we were into Tier 3 area. Now, I can honestly say that if we hadn't had capital grants, the free capital, there is no way nowadays that we would be able to do it. So I realise, of course, that because of the recession, we've had to replace it with a revenue-based thing, but it is extremely difficult compared to, say, 2003 to 2006. So I think that there will be no growth in Tier 3 unless some of the Tier 2 people can step up with private funding. And my point is that policy matters in relation to that. Now, I don't know how one resolves that. The second example of policy matters is in relation to the very ambitious plans for private rented housing in the social document. And again, we have finance setting very difficult conditions for small mom and pop landlords, unquote. They'd only allow themselves 75% of the of interest allowability, as opposed to 100% for large companies. And they will engage in double taxation at various stages. So it does seem to be, from any of the contacts we've had with people in the private rented side, and mostly they're antagonistic, but anyway, some of them are decent enough people, they're getting out of it as quickly as they can. So again, policy matters in relation to this, that if you're going to welcome in very large landowning companies from America, and allow them all the normal deductions which are there for trading companies, you can't then have a cohort of Irish-owned companies, mom-and-pop companies, and expect them to stay in the business. So my plea would be to anybody who's here from the Customs House to really, gird their loins in relation to making representations to the Department of Finance, because policy does matter in this, and we are quite weak on getting more Tier 3s into the area, and on retaining the number of private rented accommodation that is there at the moment. Thank you.
More of an opening comment than a direct question, but I'll just open it up if any of the panel do wish to add anything.
I suppose just to say in relation to the particular, I won't address the issue in terms of private rent, but there are people here from the department today, and I'm sure they are listening. The very reason that I brought up the issue in terms of the Tier 3 is that so that we can recognise now, by having this kind of analysis here, that what the sector looks like, and if we are expecting more of it, that people need to understand the structures that are there. What the policy response is to that is a matter for the department and the minister, but we're here to highlight what the structures are so that there can be a response, and hopefully by today highlighting some of those issues, the officials in the department and the minister can think about them further.
Okay, thank you. I think we had another question there. Great, thank you.
Karen Murphy, Irish Council for Social Housing. Again, another comment. We'll save the questions, I think, for now. Just want to welcome the report today. I think it's important to say that first and foremost, and to recognise the work that's gone into it. From what I've seen, it is a very positive report, and I think that reflects on the work and the groundwork that has been put in by the sector over the years. So it's actually very good to see the good levels of governance and the fact that it is a sound sector, and I think it's important again to note that. There's a lot of expectation been placed on the shoulders of AHBs for the coming years, coming out of, as Jerome has said there, a period of transition. So I think we need to, I suppose, recognise the fact that at the moment we do have a sound, stable sector, and we want it to grow accordingly. Bearing in mind, I suppose, the sort of retaining the good levels of governance and the actual good running that is there within the organisation. So, thanks very much.
Thanks, Karen. And yes, I think it's very important for everyone in the Regulation Office to get that positive message out there about a lot of the good work and, as you say, the good governance that there exists in the AHB sector presently. Rose, great. Either of you want to pick anything up? Or? Perhaps not. We can
Actually, I will. I would just like to comment on what the first speaker said, particularly around the issue of the number of Tier 3s and our Tier 2 AHBs capable of stepping up. I suppose, from my point of view, if I was to sort of put an objective hat looking at the sector on, I would have a concern indeed that there aren't enough Tier 3 organisations, and some kind of development programme would be helpful, or perhaps looking at issues such as opportunities for associations that operate in the north of Ireland to operate. I know this happens to a limited extent, but perhaps some encouragement there. I mean, I would have a concern about whether there's sufficient diversity and capacity in the sector. So there will be different ways of approaching that. I don't have an immediate blueprint, but I think it's an issue to be considered further.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We've got one here in the front section, then another there at the back. So we'll go Simon first. Mike's just coming to you now.
Simon Brook, Clwyd Housing Association. Excuse me. We are very strongly supportive of regulation, as we have been for many years, as you know. So I'm delighted to see this production today, which I think is a very positive move for the sector. What we're looking forward to more than anything else is it being put on a legislative basis. And I wonder if you can tell us when you think that's going to happen.
Well, unfortunately, the Minister isn't here today, and I can't speak for the Minister, but what I would say is that I know the Department officials, Damien Allen and Sheila Power in particular, have been working on putting together heads of bill. The committee, and I'm sure Jenny can comment further on this, have also had a role in terms of advising the Minister on that. My understanding is that heads of a bill have been approved by the Minister, and that we are, I suppose, trying to meet the time frame of having legislation in place by 2016, and we're hoping to get a memo to Cabinet shortly.
Positive news. And I think Brian had a comment or a question down at the back there.
Yeah, just two. First of all, I suppose I was delighted in terms of just one regulator, because I do think that's hugely important. I just want to know, has there been any engagement with the Property Services Regulatory Authority, which is the other body that we're required to make returns to? And secondly then, one of the strengths, I suppose, I understand from the English model is the existence of the regulator and the powers of step in if housing associations do get into difficulty, and the reassurance that gives to investors. And can you tell me what the thoughts are about how that might develop in the Irish context?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to let Rose pick up on that, and Greg, you might want to come in afterwards.
Just in terms of other regulators, yes, we have started a dialogue with other regulators. We haven't quite got to the Property Services Regulatory Authority yet, and I suppose the implications of that aren't to the whole of the sector at this moment in time. But it is an agenda that we're pushing, and I do think we have to address the issue of regulatory burden. I'm sitting on a committee at the moment, which is a committee which is looking at the Benefax, which is how can we share data better so that there isn't multiple returns in the sector, and we will, within that role particularly, I'll be looking to try and see what way can we use technology smarter. I think there's also a role within the legislation that we can use in terms of charities regulator and other jurisdictions has been able to delegate to the housing regulator, and so they're all things that we can examine further, and we can do the same with the PSRA.
Now, do we have a finance question out
So
there?
there's a question
Oh,
there
sorry,
to,
yes,
to
sorry.
Greg in
Greg,
terms
you
of
were
maybe on the
gonna
powers
point.
of step in.
Yes, that gives you a few minutes to think of a finance-related question, hopefully.
Step in. Yes, step in has been used particularly in England, but also to some extent in Scotland and Wales over the years. It's actually relatively rare that the English regulator these days will get involved in an actual step-in. They grade registered providers for governance and for viability, G1 and V1 being the top. And when you get down to G3 or V3, then the organisation is not compliant, classed as not compliant with the regulatory standards. They would only normally step in one form or another when they get to G4 or V4, and there have only actually been two organisations, one of which was Cosmopolitan, which I mentioned earlier, which have got down to the 4 level. What's much more common is that that the regulator will engineer a voluntary undertaking. That's where the organisation promises to do better, to accept several new members of their board and possibly make other changes. One reason why the English regulator doesn't like to take formal regulatory step-in engagement is because of a potential effect on borrowings. It's, if you like, an inherent flaw in the system. Many organisations have got borrowings which are based in part on the potential of a reprice of the loan if they become non-compliant and subject to regulatory enforcement. It's quite a complex area, and I wouldn't want to suggest that I think the regulator is necessarily, the English regulator is necessarily comfortable with the present arrangements.
I have to say, just speaking from my sort of role working with associations in Northern Ireland, as Greg mentioned, we do have a slightly more prescriptive regulatory regime and a quite hands-on regulator. Yeah. And even in that scenario where there have been some cases where organisations have run into quite severe difficulties, the regulator has still chosen to support and advise and guide rather than directly step in. And again, some of those concerns about repricing would be the key factors there. We probably have time for maybe one last question, if anyone would like to ask it. Just gentlemen here in the second row, please.
John Cullen, Oakley Housing Trust. It's a financial question as requested, perhaps for Sylvia. We have targets for the sector now, whatever it is, and if the sector were to succeed in achieving those targets, has there been any analysis done of how the balance sheets might look, bearing in mind the significant borrowings involved, and maybe a subset of that? Is there a tolerable gearing ratio at the maximum? Thanks.
Okay, that's a very pertinent question. At the moment, the balance sheets are very healthy. There's a huge amount of equity, as you can see. So it just makes sense to capitalise on that and leverage it. So there is a certain amount of capacity in the beginning years not to make the gearing ratio get too uncomfortable. And it's not only gearing. I mean, the banks are interested in the cash flow capacity. So you're looking at a lot of factors. And the banks have indicated that it isn't just going to be about gearing. But at the end of the day, you can't have that going too out of control. We've learnt in our lesson on that in other sectors, the dangers of that, of having too much debt. So Rome wasn't built in a day. So to a certain extent, we need to get on the path because we're safe for so far. for a certain amount. And then we may have to look at other solutions down the line, but I think we need to get on the path first and deliver the capacity that we can. It is a very ambitious programme, the 35,000. There are some ways of doing that. I mean, with the gearing, there are suggestions, the CAF funding, that perhaps while that is repayable at the end, we shouldn't regard it as debt because we're not repaying it up front. So things like that give us some space on the gearing. But there is huge capacity there. I mean, the balance sheets shouldn't look like that this time next year or in 2 years' time, and we can't be put off that down the line. There's plenty of scope initially to get going, and I mean, the department, as you say, are here, and we will address it, but it is a very pertinent question for down the line, I think. Is that fair?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to conclude this part of the session now. I'm sure this discussion will continue in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you for your questions, and also to Rosalind, Greg and Sophie for allowing themselves to be put on the spot. I'm just going to say a few very brief closing remarks, and then we'll bring the event to a close. So as I said, this will, I promise, be a very few remarks from the Regulatory Committee's perspective. 18 months on into our journey, we were established in February 2014. And Greg and Rosalind have covered the role of regulation, its benefits and its challenges, and some of the day-to-day practice of the regulator. And in some ways, what I'm going to be doing is reinforcing those messages rather than saying anything new. But where does the Interim Regulatory Committee fit into this? The committee was appointed by the previous Minister with responsibility for housing to set the strategic direction for the Regulation Office and ensure that it's well governed, transparent and accountable. And as Rosalind said, the committee has independent decision-making powers and is itself directly accountable to the Minister. And we report to the Minister on progress and outcomes and, where necessary, on areas of significant concern and non-compliance. And our role really has two main elements. We oversee the implementation of the regulatory framework and the assessment of AHBs, and that includes providing advice and recommendations on the content and requirements of the framework. We have a role in monitoring and oversight, and also in the appropriate reporting structures for AHBs. The second element of that is advising the Minister and his officials on the development of the statutory regulatory framework, bringing our collective knowledge of other relevant regulatory systems and experience gained from the implementation of the code. And I have to say, we have been very closely involved in the development of the legislation to date and been consulted on regularly on the heads of bill, and that has been a very positive experience, certainly for the committee, and I would hope for officials in the department as well. There are several members of the committee here today, and I just want to name them and draw them out, and hopefully you've had a chance to have a chat with a few of them. Dr. Una Breen, Anne-Marie Farrelly, Ronan Heavey and Donna McManus are all here. And I'd like to pay tribute to them and to all of our colleagues on the Regulatory Committee for their ongoing commitment and the significant contribution that they've made to the progress we're marking here today. Particularly important to the committee is ensuring that the principles of the effective regulation that are outlined in Building for the Future continue to guide the practice of the Regulation Office and the evolution of the regulatory framework and the legislation. And obviously you'll have gotten a strong sense of that from Rosalind's presentation. What really we bear in mind constantly as we're working through the day-to-day business of regulation is that proportionate, transparent approach that focuses on outcomes and is based upon the risk profile of an AHB and what that risk means in the overall sector context. That's not always easy. I think Greg touched on that in his presentation. For the Regulation Office, and also I imagine for AHBs, when you're getting to grips with a new system, there's a comfort in compliance and being told exactly how to meet a standard or a requirement, and also then for the regulator and being able to measure that against strictly defined criteria. And I think there will always be some elements of the regulatory framework that are clearly compliance-based. You can do a little bit of that, yes, tick the box, yes, or exit, no. But more often, that's about the demonstration of how an organisation is delivering against the standards and requirements. And that really is something for the board to determine. And similarly, regulatory assessments will demand regulatory judgment and discretion rather than necessarily adhering strictly to a scoring matrix. So that balance is one that the committee is acutely aware of and we continue to monitor. In relation to those principles, I would just like to stress, particularly on foot of some of the challenges you've heard, and that risk is not a bad thing and certainly will not be discouraged by the Regulation Office. Risk's an inherent part of being a social landlord, and never more so when you're delivering new supply and delivering new supply at scale. We recognise that, and we do want to see AHBs adopt an appropriate risk appetite, and most importantly, to manage that risk effectively. And a high-risk organisation can, of course, also be a high-performing one with the right controls. And that mention of controls leads me on to what next for the Regulation Office. Over the course of the next year, we'll be working on a governance standard and an assessment framework, building on the work that has gone on in the financial standard. That will develop some of the existing requirements in the code and also sit alongside that financial standard. As with the financial standard, we're very much committed to working with the sector to develop the governance piece, and we look forward to engaging with many of you on that. We begin our next round of returns and assessments in September. Seems like no time at all since the last set. And that will be about refining and improving our processes based upon experience of the first round, and eventually, as Rosalind pointed to, moving to published regulatory reports, although that remains a way off yet. And the committee, supported by the executive team, will remain closely involved in the legislative passage of the regulation bill. We'll continue to advise on the general principles and also on some of the specific details of the statutory basis for regulation. It will be another busy year, no doubt, but I know I speak for everyone in the Regulation Office when I say that we're excited by the opportunities ahead, working very much in partnership with the AHB sector to deliver the reforms that will enable new supply, as well as the ongoing provision of high-quality services to existing and new tenants. So in closing, I'd just like to say a few words of thanks, and I will inevitably forget to mention someone, and if I do, please know that we extend our thanks to you. Once again, I'd just like to thank the Regulatory Committee for all the work that they put in and the support that in particular they provide to me as chair, with the expertise and the experience that they bring from a very diverse range of backgrounds. I'd also like to thank Rosalind and her team in the Regulation Office. It's a small team. What it lacks in numbers, I have to say, it more than makes up for in dedication and hard work. I've been incredibly impressed by the team's resilience and their personal commitment to delivering on the office's objectives. And hopefully you'll agree that in a very short time, they've achieved a huge amount. It'd be an understatement, actually, to say that they go the extra mile. I think some are doing the equivalent of a marathon right now. To John O'Connor, the Housing Agency Board, and also the team at the Housing Agency, very much appreciate your support, and personally, John, also your counsel. That's ongoing, but actually, particularly around the launch, we've had a huge amount of support from the Housing Agency team, and I just want to say a special thanks to Ciara and the communications team for all of the work that you've put in. Unfortunately, the Minister hasn't been able to attend today. This is a busy time of year, and we fully understand that there are other pressures on his time. But I would just like to welcome the Minister and his department's support for the work that the Regulation Office is doing. I know that obviously there are a number of colleagues from DECLG here today, and hopefully they'll be able to feed back both some of the positive work that has gone into the report and the new financial standard and assessment framework, and also some of the questions that have been raised. And I'm sure they'll be encouraged by the level of interest in the sector as to the future of regulation and how that will develop in the months ahead. Working with the Department on the development of the new bill has been an informative process for us all, and it has had just the right amount of debate and challenge, and I look forward to that continuing in the future. Finally, just a thank you to all of you in the room. We very much appreciate you coming along to support us today in the launch of these two publications. I know some of you have come quite a distance, so thank you. The Regulation Office has been very encouraged by the level of interest and involvement in the wider AHB sector, and just a particular thanks as well to our colleagues in the ICSH who have been engaging very closely with us as we develop our systems and processes. I have to say, what has emerged over the course of the last 18 months is something of an enthusiasm for regulation and the benefits it will bring. And as someone who is very interested in regulation myself and sees the real value that it adds to the sector, I'm encouraged by that. So finally, just we look forward to working with you in the future and to continued constructive engagement in meeting our shared objectives of a well-governed, financially viable, high-performing AHB sector that is well placed to deliver new high-quality homes and excellent services and support for those that need them. Thank you very much.